welcome to Wide Angle. Nepal this week has had a key election take place and a communist alliance has swept, at least in the first past the post part of this election result, 118 out of 165 seats. What does their entry in this way onto Nepal's political scene mean for India? Has it been a failure of Indian diplomacy vis-a-vis Nepal? Joining us to discuss all of that, the former ambassador to Nepal, Ranjit Rae, who's back now in Delhi and retired and therefore ready to speak with us on the record. Thank you so much. Mr. Rae, really the first question I want to ask you, this alliance of communist parties that has swept at least this phase of the election, was it expected in Delhi?
Well, I think the Communist Alliance was expected to be, the first group in the elections, but perhaps the magnitude of their victory is somewhat unexpected. But let me just explain. In Nepal, you have two ways of getting into parliament. You have first past the post, which is 165 seats, of which, as you said, 118 have gone to the Left Alliance. But there are 110 seats that are elected on the basis of proportional representation. Right. And in terms of proportional representation, the UML has scored marginally higher than the Congress party. So if you look at the vote percentages, there's not too much of a difference. The reason why the first past the post went to the Left Alliance is because traditionally what was the second and the third largest parties got together. They had a seat sharing agreement, and as a result of that, in the first past the post, they swept the polls.
So in the last couple of years, especially since 2014-15 up until now, the tensions between Delhi and Kathmandu have been, like on a pendulum pretty much. And one of the reasons why KP Oli has also managed to consolidate, so to speak, this support base is a result of, many say, the blockade of 2015, where fuel and goods and essential supplies were blocked at the Tarai border between India and Nepal. How did that play out? How did the earthquake play out in this election campaign?
Well, let me explain a little bit of the context. Nepal is a very diverse society. And you have different types of communities living in that country. You have a third of the population living in the plains, and they are non-Nepali mother tongue speaking people. Their mother tongue is Bhojpuri, Maithili, Awadhi, and culturally they are very similar to the people of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. In the hills, of course, you have the Janjatis, the Mongoloid races ethnically, and of course the ruling class, which is the Brahmins and the Kshatris. So when a new constitution was being drafted, every community had aspirations that their interests, their concerns would be accommodated in the new constitution. Right. And unfortunately, one group, which is the people in the Tarai, particularly, also Janjatis to some extent, but one group felt left out or ignored in this constitution drafting process. They had certain grievances in terms of representation, in terms of inclusion, issues like that, and that's why they were protesting. So India's view in this whole episode was, it would be in the interest of Nepal to accommodate its diversity, diverse interests, because this is a constitution being drafted by an elected constituent assembly. So it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. And if these interests can be accommodated, then there will be long-term stability and peace in the country. If these interests are not accommodated, there would be tension in the society. There could even be, growing friction, possibly violence. Right. And India as a neighbor, and we have an open border, the last thing we want is the disturbed Nepal or a disturbed Tarai, which borders India. So our view was that, if you accommodate all these concerns and interests, there will be durable stability. The constitution in any case was then drafted, adopted, and these elections have been held under that constitution. The Madhesi parties have also participated in these elections, and we have the results. So going back to your question about the blockade, so India's position that diverse interests should be accommodated was projected by certain political groups in Nepal as hegemonic interference, big brother lecturing to us, and gave rise to a certain type of leadership which, you know, was projected as being strong because it can stand up to India. And clearly this kind of anti-India sentiment was stoked by certain groups, particularly within the UML. And you know, this created a certain atmosphere within the country. And this is not something new. This has always happened in the past. This was one aspect, and the second aspect, of course, was that, you know, if you have problems with India, then you try to balance the India relationship by turning to China. Yes. So, you know, these two things happened, I think we now have to take the situation as it is. I think everybody in Nepal realizes how important India is for Nepal's prosperity, progress. India realizes how important Nepal is. Yeah. Mr. Oli is a good friend of India. I mean, we may have had differences in terms of how we looked at the situation.
But there's an old relationship.
A very old relationship. And, you know, he has always said to me that, you know, everything joins us with India, our culture, our civilization, you know, the trade, yes. Nepal's trade with India, with the world actually. So I think it's a very critical relationship, and I'm sure that the new government is going to take a lot of initiatives, as are we, to strengthen this relationship.
And yet, I mean, in spite of the historical relationship that even individually KP Oli may have had with the Indian government or members of Indian political parties, or historically between Delhi and Kathmandu, the fact is that the narrative turned after the blockade, and you had Nepali leaders say, well, what are we supposed to do if not turn to China at a time like this? Could India, you were the ambassador That's at right. the time, mm-hmm. From your experience, could India have played its cards differently then?
Well, the only way we could have played our cards differently was to suggest that, okay, inclusion and political representation, you know, for the disadvantaged groups is not important.
Right.
And, you know, we were suggesting that inclusion is important for longer term stability. So I don't really see how we could have played our cards differently. You know, either you accept the status quo and you know, what happens in that society, or you know, our assessment was that if these interests are not accommodated, there'd be tensions later on. Right. So you know, take a longer term perspective and try and prevent these tensions from occurring in the future, because they affect us as well. But I think some of the leadership of Nepal was extremely conservative, and they have a certain understanding and a narrative of their nation which tends to be a little exclusivist. The thinking was that, you know, inclusion, political representation for some of the other groups is not such a critical issue. That, you know, this is something they can easily manage on their own.
In spite of the fact that it's 1/3 of the population of the country.
Yeah, and you can see in the results, for instance, in province number 2, which is in the Tarai, the result is very different from the rest of the provinces, because in the province number 2, it is the Madhesi based parties that have swept the elections. So I think in the long term, these issues will have to be addressed. How they are to be addressed, of course, is an open question.
So this is, in terms of Nepal's domestic scenario, very clear how India is going to have to really kind of now balance and walk the fine line, because it is a result of the people, for the people, by the people, as you know, as we say. But the fact of the matter is, it sort of plays many games in the neighborhood. It fits into parts of many games. One is, of course, when you look at this sort of encirclement by China of India. The Chinese are, you know, marching onwards onto areas that India has dominated, whether it is creating the maritime Silk Route or the One Belt, One Road in the north, or just hegemonically in India's neighborhood. How does something like this, an election result like this, play into that sentiment, and how do you counter it?
Well, you know, talking about China, certainly I think the Chinese are much more active in Nepal today. And of course, the rumor in Nepal was that they were very keen on this left unity, left alliance. They were backing it to the hilt. They were very unhappy when Prachanda withdrew support from the Oli government earlier. So the Chinese have certainly been much more active than in the past. And then under this Belt and Road Initiative, several agreements have been signed in terms of greater connectivity, including through railways. Some hydroelectric projects have been, given to China on a G2G basis without global tendering. So certainly the Chinese are very active. But having said that, I think if you look at the India-Nepal relationship on a scale of 1 to 10, if we are 10, China is probably 2. So this is the kind of gap. 2/3 of Nepal's trade is through India. Most of Nepal's trade with China is also through the port of Kolkata. Connectivity is through India.
For a landlocked country, that's bound to be the
Precisely.
problem.
So, of course, with changes in technology, I think, the Himalayas are no longer the insurmountable barrier that they used to be. But, this is something that we have to factor into our decision making, our thinking, and see how best to deal with it. Just to give you an out-of-the-box idea, my sense is both India and China would like to see stability in Nepal. And neither country wants to have a growing presence of or involvement of external forces, either state or non-state. China because of its concerns in Tibet. So I think there is a certain congruence. Which is an opening and which can be looked at.
Even after the earthquake, you saw many senior Nepali commentators, criticize India for its magnanimity and statements of magnanimity. They said, if you're doing something, we're in a crisis, why don't you leave it at that?
You see, it's a very complicated psychology. And it's in terms of what Nepalese national identity is. You see, if everything in Nepal, language, religion, culture, civilization is similar to India, then what is unique about Nepal as a nation state? So sometimes they find this embrace by India a little claustrophobic, and they're trying to find more political space for themselves. And so when India helps them, they need the help, they know that, but at the same time they feel resentful that India is helping them. So it's a very peculiar...
So as a foreign policy practitioner, how do you deal with this kind of a challenge?
I think you have to deal with it, in terms of greater sensitivity, greater understanding, greater respect for your interlocutor, not be patronizing. So, it's a very prickly, sensitive relationship, and one has to be conscious of that at all times.
So, sir, we're talking about this sort of pride of Nepal, the fact that there's a sentiment of national pride that played out in this election result. In a sense, if you look at global trends, xenophobia, hyper-nationalism, these are trends across the world. Nepal, as insulated and landlocked as it may be, is perhaps also not so insulated from these global trends.
In any diverse country, you have to have an idea of where the country is headed. 20 years down the road, what kind of country do you want to see? And if it's a diverse country, different people have different interests. So how do you reconcile those interests which sometimes might conflict with each other, because most of the time it's about greater power sharing, greater sharing of economic resources, and I think it's a democratic process or democratic system that is the clearinghouse for these competing interests. So, my sense is that for a diverse society, you have to accommodate everybody within a democratic framework. In Nepal now, it's a federal democratic framework. So which is, accepting to some extent the regional identities that different groups have. But this is the only way to go forward, because if this process fails, if you polarize communities and you tend to exclude certain groups, then how are those groups going to respond? So, you know, that is a recipe for potential tension in society.
So, sir, coming back to the China question, in the neighborhood, as we're seeing, and you've touched upon this just now, the trade and transit agreements that Nepal has with China, etc., China's building them up around India's neighborhood. What kind of response should India have to this?
Well, you know, I'll give you a simple answer. I think we need to step up our connectivity projects, our infrastructure projects. You know, we have a lot on the plate. Unfortunately, our implementation record has not been great and could be much, much better. And I think this is what we've been trying to do, you know, through regular monitoring. It's all nuts and bolts issues, you know, it's no great policy or strategy, but nuts and bolts issues where we tend to lose out. So I think we really need to improve the implementation of all the projects that we have.
And in terms of regional connectivity and regional networks, I mean, you know, we keep talking about SAARC, for example, and SAARC has kind of fallen into the dustbin of South Asian politics because India-Pakistan tensions have held it hostage pretty much since its inception. Is there a way, do you think there is a way to revive regional frameworks and re-energize regional frameworks and conversations that take into account the sensitivities of countries like Nepal or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka when it comes to their concerns over Indian hegemony, and say that, look, we're all in this together somehow? What are the ways to do it?
So I think efforts are being made, and this is one reason why we've tried to keep politics and bilateral issues out of these organizations. Of course, SAARC, as you said, is hostage to
India-Pakistan.
Politics of the region. But, you know, we are also looking at sub-regional groupings. So BBIN, which is Bhutan, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, has a lot of potential. BIMSTEC, again, where Bhutan and Nepal are members along with India, Bangladesh and certain ASEAN countries, also has a lot of potential. In fact, Nepal is the chair of BIMSTEC. There'll be a summit next year. So I think these regional, the sub-regional and, you know, other organizations hold a lot of potential. And a lot is happening in terms of strengthening connectivity, strengthening tourism, the Buddhist circuit. So many things are happening, and I think our focus now is really on these institutions.
So India, the MEA has made a statement obviously welcoming the new government in Nepal and sort of the statements of cooperation and working together, and it will have to be the case. But do you think this tightrope walk will continue with Kathmandu for some time going forward?
Look, we have to deal with any government in Nepal. You know, Nepal's interests in India are huge, as are India's interests in Nepal.
Right.
So clearly, you know, we have to deal with whichever government there is in Nepal. And as I said, the network of our relationships, you know, of our trade and economic interests is very, very vast. So I have no doubt in my mind that India and Nepal will work together for the benefit of both countries. And I would also like to say that Mr. Oli, who is likely to be the next Prime Minister, is a very strong and determined person and a very good administrator. Not many people know that when we were signing these project development agreements for the big hydropower projects in Nepal, this is when Mr. Oli was not the Prime Minister. He played a very major role in getting his party on board and supporting these agreements. So, you know, we expect him to focus a lot on economic issues, and this is where India-Nepal cooperation will come in.
So, sir, in hindsight, this is the final question, in hindsight, do you think that India should have, while focusing on what was happening with the Madhes and the aspirations of the people of the Madhes, etc., do you think that it should have also kind of anticipated this sentiment and focused more on building bridges across the political spectrum in Nepal, not just focusing on parties like the Nepali Congress, for example?
You know, I've traveled a lot in Nepal, and even at the height of the problems when supplies were disrupted, and amongst the people of Nepal, I found only goodwill for India. So that is the kind of relationship that we have. So, you know, these are temporary hiccups or blips that happen in a relationship, but I think the long-term trend is very positive. and our cooperation will only strengthen.
Ranjit Rae, thank you so much for speaking to The Wire. Thank you.